Well, do keep your Bibles open at that passage in 2 Samuel, and if you are in Yolg, then you will want your clipboard. We are going to refer to the timeline that is on the back of the sheet, and of course we'll be heading downstairs to chat through this passage after the service has finished. Before I start, there's just one extra notice that I need to give, and that is that we mentioned last week that we are taking up a thank you offering, a thank you collection for Bob Lawson's time as an elder here at Richmond. That's 1992 to 2024. And that money will be donated to the sponsored pilgrimage he's just undertaken in aid of St. Luke's Hospice. Bob is with us this morning. How are your feet? Oh. We're glad that went well for you, and this is the second and last chance to contribute in cash in this orange box that's just at the front here. Shall we pray as we come to look at God's word? Heavenly Father, we bow in your presence. May your word be our rule, your spirit our teacher, and your greater glory our supreme concern. Amen. I wonder if you've ever asked the question, what is God doing in the world today? It can be a tricky question to think about the answer to, can't it? When you think in the face of the mess that is the world. We started by thinking about how our lives are a mess with that whiteboard, but our world is a mess. Our media mocks Christianity. Tyrants act with complete freedom and no consequence. And there is mass ignorance or despising of Jesus, our Saviour. It's particularly hard to wonder what the answers are, what is God doing in the world, when all of those things fly in the face of the central claim of Christianity, that Jesus is Lord. That almost seems laughable. Where's the evidence? It doesn't seem as if anyone's in control, let alone Jesus. We long for friends to be saved and for the church to grow, for justice to be done, and for the Christ, that is God's King, to be honoured. But in one sense, it's not actually that much different to the rest of history. Long ago, God rescued his people Israel from slavery in Egypt through Moses. He gave them the promised land through Joshua, and then at about 1,000 years before Christ, they asked for a king. So Saul was chosen and became the king of Israel. His reign started well. Ian helped us look at that, but he decided to disobey God. His desire was greater than God's. And so God told the prophet Samuel to anoint a successor, David. Saul got wind of this, and so for many years David lived as a fugitive as Saul tried to hunt him down because he was the rival to his throne. And the book of 1 Samuel finished at the end of Saul's reign, facing defeat in battle, and then taking his own life. Well, this morning we come to 2 Samuel, the book we're going to be looking at for the next 6 or 7 weeks, and it continues the narratives that have begun in 1 Samuel. The two books were originally one work. You can find that. The Dead Sea Scrolls have them as one combined work. And we pick up the story there in the aftermath of the battle. And the news of the death of the king is starting to head out. Despite all that we've heard or read, this is a tragedy. Because despite all we've read and heard about Saul, he was still the Lord's anointed. He was God's king. He is dead. His people are defeated. Particularly this morning, we're going to focus on chapter 1, which Dan Malola read for us, on David, the new king to be's response. At the beginning of 5 chapters, which tell the story of the transition from the end of Saul's reign to David's enthronement as king over all Israel. If we had to pick one word to summarize these few chapters, it's a mess. It's not a neat transfer of power. It's not even clear, a lot of the time, who the good guys are. It's the story of David and his army commander Joab and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and his army commander Abner. Who are the good guys? Well, judge for yourself as you look at chapters 2 and 3 in the life groups this week. And you'll find the study material for that on the back of the sermon outline that you are given on your way in. Let me give you the highlight of these few chapters. The key point is found right in the middle of it as it kind of stacks itself towards this point. Chapter 3, verse 1. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. But let's turn our minds to chapter 1. Every single one of us has experienced or will experience loss and grief. Every grief is different. Every circumstance is unique. And I'm sure many of us have seen the iconic photo from a few years ago of the Queen sitting alone at her husband's funeral. It was a powerful picture, wasn't it? The Queen, who has bodyguards and palaces, grieved like so many of the rest of us during the pandemic, all alone. Here's the surprise of chapter 1 as we come to think about what some people have titled a chapter that could be called Good Grief. Our companion in our grief is the grieving king of Israel. David first, and now the king of the whole world, Jesus Christ. We're going to break the passage into 2 halves, and we're going to look at verses 1 to 16, which maybe doesn't quite fit into what you would think of as grief, but we're going to look at David's reactions to the news. David executes the king's murderer, we read, verses 1 to 16. This comes following his successful mission against the Amalekite raiders, who we read about back in 1 Samuel chapter 30, and he returns to his kind of city in enemy territory, Ziklag, to rebuild it. 3 days later, a young man arrives with news from the war between the Israelites and the Philistines. His disheveled appearance, including his unkempt hair, are deliberate signs of mourning and distress. And as David presses him for information, the young man reveals the tragic news. Saul is dead. Look with me at verse 3. Where have you come from? David asked. He answered, I have escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? David asked, tell me. He said, the men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. Then David said to the young man, who brought in the report, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the reply might surprise us, because basically the gist of what he says is, Saul is dead because I killed him. But his account differs from the actual events that are described for us in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. According to the biblical account, Saul was mortally wounded by archers and, fearing capture by the Philistines, asked his armor-bearer to kill him. When the armor-bearer refused, Saul took his own life by falling on his sword. Let's compare that to the Amalekites' account. Verse 6, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear when the chariots and riders, with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? Look then to verse 9. Then he said to me, stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. He claims that he himself delivered the final blow to Saul, but the story is suspicious because of the discrepancies. More likely, he was scavenging among the dead, came across the body of the fallen king, and stole his crown and armband, hoping to ingratiate himself with David and maybe claim a reward. However, he has misjudged David's character. Remember, David has consistently refused to seize power from Saul, even being conscience-stricken after merely cutting off the corner of Saul's robe. This reveals the young man's own ethics of advantage, where he seeks to gain from someone else's misfortune. But David, he rejects that way of going on. He's not seeking his own advantage, but the Lord's purposes. As did Jesus, the perfect king, David's greatest heir, as he faced down Satan in the wilderness. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 11 tells us that when tempted to turn stones into bread to satisfy his hunger, Jesus refused, asserting that he would not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God's mouth. When tempted to throw himself down from the temple to test God's protection, he refused, saying he would not put God to the test, but would trust in his divine guidance. When tempted to worship the devil in exchange for worldly power and dominion, Jesus refused, asserting he would worship only God and serve his kingdom alone. Jesus demonstrated his commitment to God's higher purpose and plan, and he refused to compromise his divine mission for personal gain. The act stands in stark contrast to the slain king here, his actions, Saul's actions. They were driven by self-interest and a desire for power. If you were with us or have read 1 Samuel, you'll know that Saul lost his kingdom because he plundered the Amalekites against God's strict orders. Now, an Amalekite has plundered him. Saul claimed to have wiped out the Amalekites, but he didn't. Now an Amalekite claims to have wiped out Saul, but hasn't. What will happen now that God's chosen king, David, is returning from his victorious, obedient striking down of the Amalekites? Jesus' unwavering adherence to God's will and his rejection of worldly temptations marked out his position as the true and righteous king, a leader for whom earthly desires and short-term gains would not sway, but set his face towards Jerusalem, where God wanted him to go and die for the sins of the world. Before we think about David's response, I wonder, is there a little bit of the Amalekite in each of us? Do we exaggerate our stories or accomplishments to make ourselves look better to others? Do you take advantage of other people's misfortune or weakness to gain an edge or advance your own interests? Do I do favors for others with the expectation of getting something in return, rather than genuinely wanting to help? Well, if we're following the path of our true king, we will reject the Amalekites' path of the ethics of advantage, like David did. Instead, he has two responses to the news. First, David mourns the murder of the Lord's anointed. He means Saul. When David and his men hear the details of the lost battle and Saul's death, they begin to tear their own clothes and mourn. Verses 11 and 12 say, "Then David and all of the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." Then David judges the plundering Amalekite by his own words. He discovers his identity, verse 13, and then, having previously spared Saul's life twice because he recognized the sanctity of the king's position, now recognizing the grave offense of harming or claiming to harm him that the Amalekite has confessed to, whether he's done it or not, he is deeply troubled. And verse 15, he called to one of his men, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" The message that comes across in these first few verses is clear. David is the Christ, that is the king, the chosen king that Saul was not. 2 Samuel seeks in part to establish David's legitimacy and his innocence in Saul's downfall. His loyalties and actions, particularly his defense of the Lord's anointed, including also then his friendship with Jonathan, demonstrate that he could never have taken action against Saul. No, he has waited for the Lord's timing. He has rejected the ethics of advantage. He is not guilty of slaying the king. Let's fast forward again to our King, King Jesus. In Matthew 23, Jesus laments over Jerusalem, expressing both anger and affection. He condemns the leaders as a brood of vipers for killing the prophets and plotting against him. Yet at the same time, he grieves for the people, longing to gather them under his wings like chicks. Notice how Jesus' emotions are perfectly balanced, allowing him to feel deep anger and grief and affection at the same time. As for the Amalekite, well, the sentence may seem harsh to our modern sensitivities, but behind David's motive is the concept that perhaps we need to recover: a respect for those who God anoints. That will mean leaving judgment to God, trusting God with his plan for our life, not feeling that we need to take things into our own hands. Well, how can we do that? Well, we know that the anointed king in David's line will come back victorious and will handle judgment. We do not need to take it into our own hands or take up the ethics of advantage, because Jesus will be the universal king and he will reign. The second half of this chapter shows us the king, how he sings in sadness over Saul and Jonathan, his concern being for the glory of God. Imagine when a prime minister or a president dies. We all face two choices, don't we? We can respond with shock, outrage, and sadness, honouring the post, even if we don't honour the person who holds it. Or maybe the reaction is more like what happened when Margaret Thatcher died. When she died, you may remember the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead from The Wizard of Oz re-entered the charts and made it to number 2. Given the history between David and Saul, the second one would be a safer bet. And yet David, who twice narrowly escaped Saul's attempts on his lives and couldn't become king whilst he lived, grieves. He lingers on that word from verse 10, fallen. And he writes a lament, one of the longest and most moving in the Old Testament, to honour Saul and Jonathan. Saul was Israel's first king, ensuring their names are not forgotten. You see, to David's mind, the death of Saul, of the Lord's anointed, is not the time for a party. No, this is the moment from the films where the surgeon emerges from the hospital corridor to give the waiting family the bad news. It's the moment maybe the mum opens the door to find the soldier in full military uniform standing on the doorstep. Look with me at verse 17. David took up his lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. That phrase, that final phrase, being repeated twice more. You see, this is not the time to linger on Saul's faults. David proclaims his virtues along with the more evident virtues of Jonathan. David's lament celebrates Saul and Jonathan's victories, highlighting Jonathan's bow and Saul's sword, verse 22. He highlights their unity and their warrior skills despite their complicated relationship, verse 23. He emphasizes the great riches and provisions that Saul brought to Israel, verse 24. Now you might be sat there thinking, hang on, this sounds much more like some kind of anti-corruption investigation at FIFA or Horizon, or the cover-up of infected blood, that kind of whitewashing of wrongdoings. But David's concern here is for God's reputation and his people. And that means prioritizing mourning the loss of the two men, the Lord's anointed, and the damage to God's glory over his grievances. That's why, verse 20, he doesn't want Israel's enemies to hear the news. Verse 20, tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. See, he knows that the Philistines will celebrate this victory. They will broadcast the news on every pub TV that they have, mocking Israel and their God, and singing praise to their idol Dagon, who they think brought them this victory. And then David curses the mountain where the Israelite shields lie broken, verse 21. In particular, Saul's shield, once anointed with oil, now gathering dust. It's a bleak picture. All death brings grief. it screams of the significance of sin in the world too. None of us will get out alive unless Jesus returns. And then David adds his own personal grief at the loss of his dear friend Jonathan, with whom he had a lifelong covenant bond that survived many challenges, including Saul's jealousy. Notice how he reminisces about their past, feeling the pain of loss. Notice how he talks to Jonathan as if he were still present, a sentiment that maybe you can relate to if you've ever lost a loved one. Reminiscing, I can't believe you're gone. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. And as a side note at this point, I would just like to say that I do agree with Tim Chester when he says that final phrase being taken to suggest a homosexual relationship between David and Jonathan says more about our own culture's sexualization and perversion of relationships. And interestingly, the same inferences are not made of non-biblical accounts of the same era. Remember, in a military culture where marriage could be a matter of political expedience, the bonds between fellow warriors might be deeply felt as they entered battle together. Maybe you can identify with David's words here. Maybe you've experienced such grief. Then again, maybe most of your grief is still ahead of you. Either way, there is much cause for grief in this fallen world. And even though such grief fades, it leaves a shadow. Noticeable at anniversaries, at birthdays, at Christmas dinner tables, to name but a few circumstances. Moments when we realize that the empty chair symbolizes the missing presence of a loved one, where your heart aches as the old wounds open up again. So notice that this lament comes after David's initial expression of grief. And I'm assuming he sits down and he pens this after the fact. He may compose stood up, I don't know. But he produces this lengthy expression of thoughtful grief. Engages the mind and the emotions, the memories, and the sad realities. Maybe that is a technique that might be helpful for you. Notice the way this is included, this lament form of Bible text assumes that grief is deep and ongoing. And so maybe aside from the emotional outpouring of grief, there may be a place to sensibly copy David, expressing reflective grief in a careful, thoughtful lament and offering it to God. In contrast with common impatience with grief, David pens something realistic and sympathetic, which many can return to when grief inevitably returns. Now, imagine being an Israelite learning this lament. The last king who it's about, well, that didn't go well. But here's your new one, teaching the whole nation to lament in the face of the travesty that death is. He teaches you to both honor the fallen with dignity And he teaches you his own lament for his best friend. Together, 1 and 2 Samuel explore for us the qualities needed to rule God's people effectively, often revealing a disconnect between what the people thought they needed and what God wanted to give them. What kind of king is this going to be? What kind of king is God giving his people? Do you know, often we're told that there is a disconnect. We're told that personal lives of public figures should not impact, can't possibly impact their professional roles. The fact that a political figure may deceive their spouse has no bearing on how they'll perform in office. Of course, anyone with half a brain cell knows that's absolute nonsense. Here is the perfect, not the perfect, but definitely the model, the human model of not separating the private and the public. He shares your grief, showing you his compassionate nature. Therefore, you'll trust and love him more because you can see his deep feelings. He really is a human. He really he's a real person. If he can love his friends so deeply, imagine his love for the nation he leads. And if he feels the pain of death so publicly, won't he be better placed to understand and sympathize with our own pain and grief? And so let me take you to a graveside scene with the king from the line of David. Jesus stands by a tomb. Whose tomb? Well, John chapter 11 tells us the sisters of the deceased sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Lazarus, Jesus' close friend, the one Jesus loves, has died. Have in your mind the grief of King David for Jonathan, and come and watch King Jesus now in John 11. When Jesus saw her weeping, that's one of the sisters, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Can you see him weeping? These are real tears. That is real grief. My friend is gone. Death has robbed me of him. And what should we make of this weeping king? Well, the Jews who were watching said, see how he loved him. See, when our loved ones die, Jesus doesn't say, I'll see you when you're done crying. I don't do tears. It's awkward when my followers get weepy. No, we've seen Jesus in the graveyard, falling apart over the death of his friend. We've witnessed the depth of his love and the extent of his grief. We know this man, this king, is made of the same stuff as we are. Don't you want him to sit with you when you're grieving too? He gets it. He loves. He cares. But more than caring, he can help. Jesus takes the depth of grief and love he experienced and turns it into healing for his brothers and sisters. Go back to that moment where the queen grieved alone. The nation saw in her, she gets it. She's been where so many of us have been this year. So too with King Jesus. Hebrews chapter 4 tells us this, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, if that reminds you of the verse we use as the title for Draw Near, that's convenient because it is tonight. But our eternal, blessed, transcendent God, who dwells in unapproachable light, can't be pierced with grief as we experience it. Death can't reach up to God and start wrecking him. But now the same king who was in the garden, with his full human nature, who feels sympathy for us in our weakness, is one who has experienced it too. And so we can approach God's throne in tears, with confidence to receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. We can do sympathy for each other. We should do sympathy for each other. But by his Spirit, he can be in the heart, knowing your grief, my grief, our grief as we feel it, in the hospital or hospice room, by the graveside, and in those hollow months that follow. And then, when we think we've grasped the full extent of Jesus' goodness as our King and our friend, there's more to discover. In times of grief, we often yearn for more than just sympathy. We desire a solution. And while David, in chapter 1 here, can only lament, our King Jesus resurrects. Let's go once more into that cemetery. Stand by Jesus at his beloved friend's graveside and watch what happens next. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." And as surely as Jesus walked out of his own tomb, he will do the same for everyone who dies, but who love him. Let's finish. Maybe you know the phrase, "The king is dead, long live the king." It's a traditional expression used to acknowledge the passing of a monarch while welcoming their successor. Well, in 2 Samuel 1, Saul is dead due to his own disobedience. Long live King David, though he's only going to manage to be king of Judah for the next while, whilst the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul continues. Did you notice in verse 2? Perhaps those words, "on the third day," help us see the significance, that prophetic pointer towards the new meaning that phrase has in the context of Jesus' death and resurrection. The King, Jesus Christ, by the end of the first Good Friday, was dead. Not for his disobedience, but for ours. And it seemed that hope was gone. But 2 days later, on the third day, Christ the King returned, according to the scriptures, Paul reminds us. And so whilst the world awaits our King's visible reign over the whole world, which will include the judgment of evil and the end of suffering and death, it's worth asking, why would one choose to navigate these challenges without the companionship and guidance of Jesus? He understands us. He understands grief like no one else. He cares deeply for us and has willingly entered into our world of brokenness and suffering and mess, that he might stand by us, might stand in our place, and as we trust him, might stand with us in our times of need. The King is dead, but long live the King, Jesus, the one who brings hope, resurrection, and eternal life.